Russia has invaded its Eastern European neighbor, Ukraine. Missiles are flying all over the place, tanks are rolling through, soldiers are fighting, and people are dying. And there's even been talk of nuclear escalation. In this episode, we'll try to explain some of the motivations driving this conflict, including ones you likely haven't heard in mainstream media. And we'll wade through a messy marsh of global politics to make some sense of what this means in the context of the New World Order. I'm Paul Dragoo, and this is Freedom is the Cure. To discuss the hottest news item on the planet, I've called on two of my smartest colleagues, Behreandt and Christian Gomez. Dennis is the publisher of the New American Magazine and the author of the upcoming book, Endgame. Christian is the JBS research manager and a foreign policy expert. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having us here.
So let's just dive right in. So officially, the motivations that we're hearing about for this conflict is that Russia is attacking because it does not want Ukraine to join NATO. What do we make of that narrative? And I assume there's more to it. Which one of you guys wants to start? Dennis, you want to take it?
Well, that is the stated position of Putin in his remarks right before the war kicked off, right before he kicked off that invasion, which is NATO expansion should not be taking place. And he pointed all the way back to the end of the Cold War when we had repeatedly given assurances that we would not be extending NATO to the borders of Russia, and yet that's exactly what we pursued. The Baltic states became members of NATO, and when it came down to Ukraine and the initial rumblings that Ukraine should move more toward the West, particularly after the events of 2014, when an elected government that was pro-Russian was replaced in a coup by a government that was pro-West, that really kicked off a lot of hostile feelings with regard to Russia versus the NATO states. And there's been talk since that time of whether or not Ukraine might profitably become a NATO member, how that might look. And in most recent days, there were some rumblings out of the Ukrainian government about the possibility or desirability of Ukraine reacquiring some sort of nuclear capacity. And from Putin's own statements, this was beyond acceptable, and so that was the expressly stated reason for kicking off those hostilities that we see right now.
Christian, why does Putin see NATO or Ukraine joining NATO as a threat?
Well, just think about it. Look at history. When NATO was formed back in the 1950s, it was formed ostensibly to counter the Soviet Union, the spread of communism, and to prevent an invasion from any of the Warsaw Pact countries into Western Europe. Now, when the Cold War, supposedly ended, you would think that the need for NATO would go away too. There's no more Soviet threat ostensibly, no more communist threat ostensibly. So why do we need NATO? But Dennis just mentioned, NATO kept encroaching into the Eastern European, former Eastern Bloc countries, Poland, Hungary, and so forth. And when Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania joined, these were three former, not just Warsaw Pact dominated nations, but these were three former Soviet republics that made up the USSR. So now part of what was once the sovereignty of the Soviet Union is now occupied with American forces, British forces, our military, our missiles, and so forth, right up against Russia's border in former Soviet territory. And if Ukraine joins, if you just look at a map, you would see that that would leave most of Russia's borders occupied by NATO forces. And of course, when you look at the history of Ukraine, a lot of that history is very muddy, going back and forth, but a lot of that is also Soviet and Russian territory historically. So now you would have American and British and other NATO forces in what was once parts of Russia and parts of the Soviet Union. Well, all of the Soviet Union, actually.
So you guys think Putin, I hate to justify anything, KGB communist tyrant. No, but do you think Putin has a point? Is there a way to look at this from Putin's perspective and see, we can see, you've answered it in a sense. It's like, well, he's got, the United States, NATO, who I guess he sees as enemies, right? Is that still, I know some of this would be speculation because we obviously have no way to know what he sees, how he thinks, unless he has stated it. But he sees the U.S. and he sees NATO and the European Union as enemies in a sense, right? As a threat, right?
Well, it would seem to be, but in this case, whenever there's a war, first of all, it's an epic policy failure, but more than that, it's a crime against humanity. So in this case, regardless of whatever motivations Putin may have felt were necessary to impel him into this hostile action, attacking people, killing people, destroying their lives, destroying infrastructure is an evil. Straight up, it's an evil. This is not a just war, and this should not be happening. Does that mean there is no other blame to go around? Is Putin the only person who is responsible for this? Well, I think there's a lot of other blame to go around as well. But nonetheless, the truth on the ground right here is this is an evil war, as are most wars, and this war should not be taking place.
Let's talk about that other blame. Where does the West wrong in this? And clearly, that's the case.
Well, Dennis actually touched on it when in 2010, Ukraine had an election. They elected a pro-Kremlin president, President Yanukovych. Oh boy, I can't even pronounce his name. Yanukovych.
Yeah.
They elected a pro-Russian president, Yanukovych.
Watches Latvian TV.
Yeah. So they elected a pro-Russian president, Yanukovych, and there was the CIA coup, essentially, to have him removed from power. Then we had an interim government, and since then they've had pro-Western governments. See, ever since the collapse of the USSR and the Maastricht Treaty to form the modern European Union, as it is currently, there's been a desire from the West, by the West that is, to have Ukraine be a member state of the European Union. So the West has certainly been doing a lot to make sure that that happens. There's been a lot of U.S. and British intelligence activities happening in Ukraine to make sure that the Ukrainian people and the government sides with a pro-Western policy.
Let's touch on the history between these two countries. I don't know how familiar here in the West we are, but there's a lot of bloody history between Ukraine and Russia. Dennis, you want to start off with some of, for instance, what Stalin did?
Well, it goes back a long way before Stalin. The area in the Ukraine, particularly Kiev, is central to the Russian idea of the Russian culture, the Russian state of mind, the Russian identity. Kiev is a key early medieval component of that Russian identity. So it's not possible to really separate much of what's happening in even modern Ukraine and modern Russia from the idea that these are really, in a sense, brother and sister states. They grew up together under the same sorts of conditions, and they have a very long and entwined cultural history. So there is that element to it that we may not be here in the West fully cognizant of, but that I can assure you the people in Ukraine and the people in Russia and the people in the Baltic states are very cognizant of. Secondarily, if we move into the modern world, if you were the 20th century, for instance, there has been a bloody history there. The Soviets conducted a terrible starvation campaign in Ukraine, the Holodomor, killed millions of people, starved them to death, removed food supplies, which is particularly egregious considering that Ukraine is one of the great breadbaskets of the world in terms of agricultural capacity and agricultural production. But that Soviet policy was, we're going to move that food to somewhere else. These people who have an independent streak with regard to being small plot holders and small farmers, they need to be wiped out because they're too close to being naturally anti-communist. They need to be taken care of. They need to be wiped out. And so this terrible famine was put in place against the people of Ukraine, and millions of people died, starved to death in the most horrific conditions that we can barely imagine. And the crime here in the U.S. was that we could have covered that in our press. The New York Times infamously covered it up. And that was a crime here on our own soil to cover up what was one of the worst genocides of history.
Holodomor, we wrote about it at least once in 2009, and I think the estimate was upward or at least 10 million people, 10 million Ukrainians were starved. And in some of those instances, the grain, the food that was taken from these villages, from these people, ended up in these bins that ended up rotting. That's how maniacal and evil this is. So there's that antagonistic aspect of it. But moving forward to today, I spoke to one of our TNA contributors, Veronica Karolinko, And she had mentioned how, from speaking to friends and or family members down on the ground, not all Ukrainians are opposed to the Russians coming in. Apparently, there's been instances where, they've even lit off fireworks. They've rolled out the red carpet for them. What do you make of that, Christian?
Yeah, we don't hear a lot about that from the Western media. We're typically hearing what's happening in the capital city of Kiev and the other western parts of Ukraine, which are more pro-West. But if you look at the eastern Ukraine and the southeast region, especially the Crimea, the population of those areas is majority ethnically Russian, and most of them speak even the Russian language as opposed to the Ukrainian language. So this goes back really to history. For example, the Crimea was originally part of Soviet Russia, and it was administratively handed over to Soviet Ukraine in 1954 as a sign of goodwill to the Ukrainian people, that the Soviet communist government believes in the Ukrainian people to sort of build up that bond, because of course the Holodomor is not something that's forgotten by the Ukrainian people. So that was done as a gesture there, but nevertheless the population remains, even to this day, majority Russian in the Crimea, which the Russians occupied in 2014 and still have today. And then in the Donbass region, the eastern part of Ukraine, where those so-called people's republics were formed, of Luhansk and Donetsk, those two republics, again, majority Russian population there, and they see themselves as wanting to be with Russia, and they see themselves as part of the Russian state. And even Crimea had a referendum to vote whether to be part of Russia, which was overwhelmingly in favor. Of course, the West doesn't claim that that's a legitimate election because they were under Russian gunpoint. But even if you take out those Russian guns, you still have a majority of Russian people there. It would be like, just theoretically, this might sound a little crazy, but just hypothetically, if the U.S. was at war with Canada, let's just say, and Canada somehow was victorious initially and took over Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, some of the northern states, North Dakota, and then all of a sudden it stayed that way for several decades. But those of us who lived here in Wisconsin, North Dakota, Minnesota, we're Americans. We want to be part of America. Then the U.S. comes several decades later and reclaims that. We would be rolling off the red carpet for the USA, not for. We wouldn't be, with the Canadian flag. So that's kind of a way to put that in our perspective, since this conflict is so far away from us.
Putin alleges that there's been, I guess within the last decade, I'm not sure, there's been some aggression by Ukrainians against Russians. Do you know anything about that? Does that sound legitimate?
The claims are that there, from the Russian side anyway, that there's even what they would call a genocide taking place in the people's republics that Christian just mentioned, and that ethnic Russians have been targeted and that their infrastructure has been hit by the artillery. They're claiming that even now that's taking place, that Ukrainian forces, Ukrainian militia are firing artillery into those regions at civilians. And that's part of the justification that the Russians are saying they have for going in and trying to put a stop to this. They're trying to save lives. In any way, that's what the Russians claim, at least in part, that's what their military operation is all about. One of the problems that we have here in the West really is to understand what really is taking place there. There's not a lot of quality news reportage that comes from there or really anywhere else these days, and the fog of war has been incredibly thick right now. So it's very difficult to know what is true and what is false. And the best we can do is make educated guesses based on reading as many sources as possible and watching as many sources as possible. And even then, it's difficult to know for sure exactly what's happening.
What about energy, natural energy, fossil fuels, as they're called? There's been commentary that there's a large aspect of this conflict that centers on that. What do you think of that?
I think that's absolutely the case. In fact, you've seen for a decade now, you've seen relative efforts made by the West to interfere with the delivery of fuel supplies from Russia to Europe. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline, for instance, has been a point of intense contention between United States-led contingencies and Russian contingencies with regard to the supply of fuels to Western Europe. So Ukraine is right in the mix with that. Many supplies. There are many pipelines through Ukraine from Russia to Europe. There are many other supply linkages between Russia and Europe through Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine itself supplies a great deal of economic goods, especially agricultural goods and raw materials. And so Ukraine is very strategically oriented with regard to transport and supply of goods and materials through Russia to Europe. So that makes it a very intense area for control if you're looking at, from an imperial standpoint, whether you're a Russian imperialist or, from the globalist position of NATO. Controlling Ukraine really becomes a key element, and that presents problems for traditional Americanist foreign policy, which is based on the idea that we do not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy or in search of monsters to fight. And we should not be imperialist. The United States was not built to be an imperialist nation. We're built to be a republic of 50 free states in the modern world. And we should not be looking at foreign entanglements. And of course, everything we're doing in Ukraine, when you boil it all up through NATO, that is a foreign entanglement. And we have to ask ourselves, is that the type of situation as Americans that best serves our purposes as American citizens moving forward?
What do you think of that, Christian?
I agree with everything that Dennis just said.
Yeah, you think?
I mean, if you just look at a map where Ukraine is just located, it's a key trade route, even from the Middle East, land-wise, into Europe, and those pipelines are quite essential. So if you want to bypass Russian oil and gas pipelines, having a pipeline that would go from the Middle East through Ukraine into the rest of Europe would be a huge benefit to Western Europe and NATO and the European Union. And
there's a lot of talk about that now, and it's mainstream talk about how even we, the United States, are somewhat dependent or reliant on Russian energy. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of a sidebar to what we're saying, but isn't that crazy? Isn't that crazy that we have all the natural energy at our feet, like literally under the ground? I guess we know the answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Why do we do these crazy things? Why would we rely on someone who is so antagonistic to traditions of freedom and liberty when we have that energy at our feet? What do you think, Christian? I mean, I know it's kind of a given, but go ahead, tee it up, man.
Actually, I'll let Dennis take this one.
Well, I think with regard to energy, there's an awful lot of money in play, right? And whoever controls Ukraine is going to have the ability to control the future of Europe in a large way. So if, let's say, in an imperial sense, Russia can control Ukraine, Russia already has exercised a great deal of theoretical control over the prosperity of Western Europe, because it controls whether or not energy flows there. Right. It's much easier to deliver energy supplies from Russia to Europe than it is to transport it across the ocean from the United States or from North America to Europe. Principally, we would be sending liquefied natural gas on ships to Europe, for instance, to replace what might otherwise be delivered via pipeline from Russia. It's much more efficient to deliver it via pipeline from Russia. But that gives Russia some degree of foreign policy control over the activities of the Central European states in particular. And the key Central European state is Germany, and the key state in the European Union is Germany. So allowing, from the point of view of a NATO strategist, for instance, allowing a closer relationship between Germany and Russia, which puts Russia in the position of having a certain level of coercion control, potentially, over Germany, puts the European Union not in the orbit of the North American Atlanticist point of view, but in the orbit of the Russian, in the Russian orbit. And that is a strategic problem if you're a globalist from the North American or UK point of view. Mm-hmm. You want that control. You don't want to see that locus of control shift there. So if we can, from the point of view of NATO, if we can control Ukraine, we can prevent that from happening, and we can keep the European Union and Western Europe in general oriented toward the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the North Atlantic integrationist point of view, and the Washington foreign policy consensus, if you wish to call it that has been with us since the end of World War II. So this is the strategic point of Ukraine right now, and that's what's taking place there.
You mentioned imperialist agendas and the globalists quite often. There's perhaps, I think, a lot of people who see this, and unfortunately there's more sympathy towards Putin than I think we'd like to see somewhat. But a large part of that seems to be perhaps because some believe that Putin is throwing a stick in the spoke of the globalists, the worldwide agenda for the new world order. What do you make of that, Christian? Is Putin an anti-globalist?
The short answer is no, but there's a lot of evidence, I guess you could say, to say that maybe he might be, and I could see why someone would fall for the trap of believing he's an anti-globalist. For example, in Russia in general, the term New World Order, since the breakup of the Soviet Union, has the connotation of being a Western globalist attempt to take over the world and make Russia a vassal state of the New World Order. Now, does that mean that Putin is fighting the New World Order? Well, he may be fighting if it's led by the U.S. and the U.K., but Putin also wants a New World Order. He wrote an article about the need for the Eurasian Economic Union. And in his article, he talks about how it would be built on free trade principles. This is, of course, the economic union for Russia and most of the former Soviet space. So in that article, he discusses how it's meant to be like the European Union, but yet separate. But eventually, he seeks to harmonize European Union with the Eurasian Union, and eventually even other regions like North America and other economic unions that exist around the world. So Russia is not anti-globalist in that aspect. They're also a member nation of APEC, which seeks in its documents outright to form a free trade area of the Asia-Pacific and FTAAP. In fact, many of the architects of Obama's TPP say that the end goal of the Trans-Pacific Partnership is to create a free trade area of the Asia-Pacific, which would include not just China, which is not yet part of the TPP, but will be eventually, because that's part of the plan, but also Russia, since they are, their most eastern part of their country has territory in the northern Pacific. So Russia is part of the plan to be integrated with that, and there has been a plan since for decades now for an east-west convergence. So what you're seeing now with Putin invading Ukraine, you see the whole world rally in favor of Ukraine against Putin, and it's making the position of the EU and NATO much stronger than ever before. Think about it. In 2016, we had we had Donald Trump. Donald Trump come in, and we had Brexit voted on. It looked like it was a move against globalism, and now we're seeing a move more in favor of globalism. The way I think this conflict will end is that eventually Ukraine will probably end up being part of the European Union.
Which they just applied for.
Yeah, they've just applied. So I see that as happening long term. It may not happen in the short term, because who knows, if Russia totally occupies it soon, then that would really put a wrench in that for happening immediately. But I believe that eventually Ukraine will be part of the European Union. That's the plan. And you're going to have the many Ukrainians who voted for someone like Yanukovych, for example. They will vote to elect to the European Parliament pro-Kremlin individuals, a communist bloc, and you will see the European Union slowly become more socialistic. The European Union already is socialist.
How much more socialist can you get?
Well, I guess more socialist in terms of Soviet socialist.
They have to go to full-blown communism.
Full-blown communism, because the current Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, he is a social democrat. He's actually more to the left than Angela Merkel, if that could be believed. So the plan will be to fully integrate them. Putin won't be in power forever. Eventually, he'll leave the scene, whether it's through a mass election or a revolution of some sort, or he dies in office. But at some point, he won't be in charge. Someone else will be in charge of Russia. I imagine that next person in charge of Russia may be someone who opens up the door more to the West, and we see Russia itself become part of the European Union, merging the Eurasian Economic Union with the European Union to accomplish the goal of East-West convergence. But for the communists, though, those in the Eastern Bloc areas, China, Russia, and other Eurasian countries, they want to have a new world order that's fundamentally led by Russia and China. And we already see that in play. Listen to people like George Soros. So while he's playing the side of pro-Ukraine in this, he has also said simultaneously, with regards to the Great Reset and the New World Order, that China has to own it. Well, China is linked up with Russia, and for those Western analysts who say, well, we got to play China against Russia or Russia against China, that's foolish. They're both member states of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, which is essentially a ginormous Eurasian bloc of China, Russia, and most of the former Soviet republics. And if Putin succeeds in the immediate, we would likely see some sort of puppet regime implemented in the Ukraine. Maybe Yanukovych will be reinstalled as president, since he was the democratically elected president of Ukraine in 2010, who was removed from office. So he might come to power, theoretically. And if he comes to power, he would probably move to put Ukraine in the Eurasian Economic Union immediately, and with that also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But eventually, these names won't matter ultimately, because they will all be merged into one global economic new world order. And if Putin and those in the Kremlin and Beijing have their way, they intend to lead it.
So is that what this is? Is this a battle for who leads the new world order, not necessarily that a battle against it? What do you think, Dennis?
That is what I think is happening here. I think you can, in my opinion, you can look at Ukraine as sort of the fulcrum, and there's a teeter-totter taking place on top of that fulcrum, in a sense that we have the Western, Washington, London sphere of influence, and you have the Beijing, Moscow sphere of influence on the other side. And right now, the locus is Ukraine, and who's going to control it, and who controls it is going to be the center of power potentially for that future integration.
Wow. So sounds like a no-win situation, really. You know, the West is obviously on the side of Ukraine, and understandably so to some degree. Is that true? Is there any way you could look at this and you know, what are you rooting for? What do people who value freedom and independence, what can we possibly ask for, and what would be the best case scenario as far as outcomes?
Actually, Dennis, you touched on this before we recorded, and I think it'd be great if you touched on it again regarding one of Russia's northern neighbors, Finland.
Oh, yes, Finland. Well,
this is how this starts,
sure.
By the way. We have these conversations and like, you know what? This would be a good podcast. So anyway.
Thank you for reminding me. Yeah. But, well, you know, in terms of Ukrainians and the nation state of Ukraine, and I think this really can go for any nation state, really the best possible outcome is for a free and neutral nation. The people should be free to conduct their business. They should have the freedoms that Americans have long enjoyed for themselves and fought to protect, that are recognized by our Bill of Rights and protected by the Constitution. And wouldn't that be wonderful if a free and neutral Ukraine that recognized those freedoms for all Ukrainians could emerge from this some unlikely future? I mean, because right now it certainly doesn't look like that could be the case. But you know, what really determines the fate of nations is what the people of those nations want for themselves. And so often, the people of every nation, they are surrounded by and swamped with and suffused with propaganda that seeks to maneuver them and nudge them and manipulate them into supporting things that are against their own interests. If you talk to the average person, and I don't care if you're talking to the average Russian, the average Ukrainian, the average American, the average Canadian, anyone in the world, what do they want? They want to have solid economic stability for themselves and for their family. They want to raise their families, go to work, do their job, live their lives without interference. They want to be free. They want to be peaceful. They want to enjoy their neighbors. They want to enjoy their families. Government so often gets in the way of this with its various machinations for power, and power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. We need to keep these principles in mind. And if we can keep these principles in mind, we see things happen that go against the interests of those who are seeking power. Brexit was one. The people of the UK, they were like, what's going on with the EU is against our interests. We want out of the EU. We want Brexit. In the United States, we don't want to see the uniparty continue in power. We want to put in power as a president someone who is going to disrupt that. Let's elect Donald Trump. We may not think Donald Trump is the best man, but he might be the best person for disrupting the globalist uniparty that has been represented in Washington for so many years. So if people can escape from the constant propaganda that surrounds them, the constant nudging that the state is doing to get them to back the policies and procedures that tend to the accumulation of state power, the people will work for their own best interests, which is freedom, prosperity, neutrality, and good relations with their friends, neighbors, and whether those are the friends and neighbors across the street or the friends and neighbors across the frontier and across the border in the neighboring country. And trade can develop, prosperity develops, everyone's better off. We don't need these militaristic efforts that are taking place. They're damaging to everyone.
What about the narrative that if we don't stop them, this could be another World War II scenario where, Hitler said, well, I'm only going to take Czechoslovakia. And then, of course, that wasn't true, because that's obviously a major point made by everyone, neocons, leftists, everyone, is that we have to get involved. So let's finish off and start talking about American involvement. What do you think of that narrative? And is that, it sounds legitimate, obviously, because historically it has happened. Chamberlain, said the same thing, right? When Hitler kept marching, and then
he waived a little peace treaty when he came back.
Yeah.
Soon after that, he was no longer prime minister.
Right.
Winston Churchill took the reins. I do fear that situation that you're bringing up, because one of the things that I expect that could come from this, may not happen, I hope it doesn't happen, but it could come from this, is that Mitt Romney, if you recall, in 2012, he was debating Barack Obama, and I remember specifically when the candidates were asked who you thought was the greatest geopolitical threat to the United States. And people were maybe expecting to hear like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, something along those lines, something in the Middle East. And Romney said he thought that Russia was the greatest geopolitical.
Is that when Obama chuckled? He's like, this guy's from the 1960s or 80s. Right?
He said that the 1980s had called them, and that they wanted their foreign policy back.
Right.
And the media, of course, next day was making Mitt Romney look like he's wacky and out of sync with time. Mm-hmm. But now there's even articles in leftist publications. We hate to admit it, but we were wrong and Mitt Romney was right. So the left is now, even some on the left are saying Mitt Romney was right. And what I fear is that this could be the opportunity that the neocons take advantage of the situation and say, look, we should have elected Romney then. We need to elect someone like Mitt Romney now to stand up to Putin, because the Obama, Biden, Kamala Harris administration, they've put us in this weakened position, so we have to elect somebody strong who doesn't have ties to the Kremlin, and who better than never-Trumper, neocon globalist Mitt Romney. So that's something that could come out of this, and we should be looking to see if Romney even throws his hat in the race in a couple of years, because we still don't know who all the candidates are going to be. I mean, I'm pretty sure Donald Trump's going to run, but it's yet to be seen who else will also run. And the media is already trying to blame Trump on this somehow, even though Putin invaded Georgia under George W. Bush, Putin invaded Crimea and the other parts of Ukraine under Obama's watch, didn't invade anything under Trump's watch. But somehow Trump is at fault in this.
Well, let's touch on that really quick too. Another popular talking point is that, and I guess coming from the right, is that had Trump been in charge, had he been the president right now, we wouldn't be having this. We wouldn't be seeing this. What do you think of that, Dennis?
Well, that's very speculative.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think. My personal opinion is I don't think Trump was a warmonger, and I don't think Trump would have worked to engineer this type of situation. He may have even worked to try to have had friendly relations to the extent possible with Russia, and I think that we saw the beginnings of that in right after his original election in 2016. But there is a strong contingent, and a bipartisan one at that is very antagonistic to Russia for the strategic reasons I talked, the way they think about strategy. And they would not give up their agitation regardless of Trump being in the presidency. They didn't, in fact, throughout Trump's presidency. They agitated the anti-Russian angle continuously. It was a big part of the so-called Russia, get Trump out of office campaign. But that was only one aspect of it.
Meddling in elections.
Exactly. So I don't think necessarily putting one person in the presidency who is anti-war and who is pro-free trade, in the classic sense of, liberal trade, you're free to trade with who you wish because it's your money, your dollars, your business. Go ahead and, do your business work.
Yeah.
I don't think someone in the presidency who represents that libertarian type of position is necessarily by themselves able to head off U.S. foreign policy in its aggressive phase. That takes a lot more work by citizens who want to have elect good people to Congress, who want to support those people, who want to support good legislation. This is long-term work that you can't solve it by just one presidential election.
Americans are concerned, as they should be, in the short term especially, of American soldiers ending up in this big old mess over there. What are the chances that we always like to say, hey, there should be you can't go into war without congressional approval. When you and I were discussing this, it's like, well, that's not necessarily the case. What are the chances, or how could American soldiers end up in this big old mess over there in Eastern Europe?
Fortunately for now, the U.S. right before this invasion happened, the U.S. pulled out its the National Guard forces. I believe even the state of Florida that were in Ukraine. They pulled them out, and Boris Johnson has committed. Well, not I guess that's the right word, but he has determined not to send British troops into Ukraine right now because both Johnson and Biden agree and believe that if you send American forces into the Ukraine right now, that would lead to immediately World War III. And Putin has even said that if any of the NATO countries take any aggressive stance against his forces, that they would see a punishment that your countries have not seen ever in their histories.
Yeah.
And he's even spoken more loudly about nuclear war. And even the dictator of Belarus, Lukashenko, has said that the West is pushing Putin to a nuclear World War III. So I think the U.S. and the West in general, the NATO countries, are hesitant as to how much they get involved because they don't want to be they don't want to be the cause of World War III, even though one could argue maybe it's already started. So if the U.S. One of the things that the Ukraine wants, for example, is a no-fly zone imposed there. Well, how would you impose a no-fly zone? Well, you'd have to have the air forces of the NATO countries enforce that. Well, what would happen if you have Russian fighters and bombers flying through the airspace, and all of a sudden, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, or the Royal Air Force, the U.S. Air Force intercepts one of those Russian aircrafts, and they refuse to leave the Ukrainian airspace, and they start attacking as a target on the ground. Does the U.S. and the U.K. and the Germans, do we attack? If we do, that would be considered a provocation and probably even the actual start of a nuclear exchange that could develop from that. So I think the U.S. and NATO in general will be very hesitant to send in troops on the ground, but I would not be surprised if there's some sort of American presence that might already be there that's highly classified, off the books kind of mission that could be occurring, whether it's Navy SEALs, Delta Force, or some other highly secretive forces. Of course, there's also the Ukrainian Foreign Legion. There could be Americans there and Brits there. What if some of those people get captured and then they're shown on broadcast on Russian television as evidence of American or British or NATO involvement? That's one way that I could see the Russians claiming, oh, the U.S. has crossed that red line. Another thing that could potentially happen would be a misunderstanding or a miscommunication of some sort. For example, there were some Russian aircraft that flew into the airspace of Sweden. What if there's some sort of accidental crossing of borders? Pilots sometimes do make mistakes. It happens less and less, fortunately, with the better GPS capacities of aircraft that we have today. But nevertheless, what if something like that happens where there's a misunderstanding and shots are accidentally exchanged? So I could see that happening. With NATO forces in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia so close to the situation, it would not surprise me if accidentally or intentionally that something could be triggered just in that little region there. And then we saw this footage that's being repeated on the cable news of Lukashenko talking to his generals. He has a map, and in the map on the bottom it shows Moldova and a part there, the Transnistria region, which is another one of these other self-proclaimed people's republics. And if you do some research into it, you see a lot of communist symbology and iconography there as well, but of Russian forces attacking from there. I would look at the border areas because that's where something could transpire that could lead to a further escalation of the conflict. I mean, if Belarus officially does invade and send in its forces, that would be another country involved. Would the West then consider taking some sort of action against Belarus? That could be the start of a bigger war. Then the Russians say, "Oh, you've attacked Belarus. Belarus is a member state of the Union state, which we belong to with Belarus. We're going to defend Belarus." So this could really escalate in many different ways, depending on what happens.
So what you're saying is it's incredibly volatile.
It's like walking on a room where there's shattered glass everywhere, and you want to get to the other side without cutting your feet.
Speaking of incredibly volatile, how volatile is Mr. Putin? Of course, we brought up this nuclear option, and he seems to have hinted at it, if not outright mentioned it. Do we really think he's that crazy? I mean, the guy's 70. He's a calculated, methodical former KGB officer. Is he just talking smack? Is he trying to just intimidate or... Obviously, you have no way of knowing what the heck is in this guy's mind. But can we honestly, is there reason to suspect that he's crazy enough to push that button, knowing that there are just as many, if not more, nuclear capacity on the other side?
I think he's crazy enough.
Yeah?
Yeah, I really do. I don't think he has any fear of these things whatsoever. I think that if he felt that it was in his interest as someone who wanted to have a preeminent role in leading the world to launch a nuclear weapon in some way, shape, or form to achieve either a tactical or a strategic goal, I don't think he would shy away from doing it.
All right.
Maybe I take a dim view of Putin, but I think he would do it.
Well, what do we know about the guy other than he was a KGB officer? For many, that would be enough. I think for us, as those of us who have somewhat of a history of what the KGB is capable of. I was born.
It's the sword and shield of the revolution, as Lenin put it.
Yeah. So okay.
And it's still the symbol of the FSB and the SVR, the two bodies that succeeded the KGB. They still maintain that emblem.
Right. Well, let's finish off with this. Is there as Americans, Westerners, but especially Americans, since that's most of our audiences, are there any actions or views or anything we can ask our legislators to do or to ensure to make the best of this mess? Get us out of NATO. Apparently, you and I had spoken off camera that NATO may be a way to get our soldiers involved in this.
Yeah, NATO's an entangling alliance. I hate to say it, but it's true. Article 5 of NATO obligates us to come to the defense of any other NATO nation, as it does with all the other NATO nations. So let's just say, for some reason, Belarus attacks Lithuania. Seems like that wouldn't happen, but you just never know. There's been some tension there in the past. Suddenly, under the treaty, the NATO treaty, suddenly there we are. We're at war. We're at war with Russia. We're at war with Belarus. And so as an entangling alliance, NATO is inherently dangerous. And because it's an entangling alliance, NATO undermines the war-making powers of Congress. So, Congress wouldn't have the opportunity to declare war under those circumstances. We would be forced into that war. So that removes that responsibility from Congress. It removes it a very important step away from the American people, and it obligates the American people to do things that may not be in their interest. So I would argue that, especially now that, the Cold War ended decades ago now, we had this conversation as a nation when that happened. What is NATO's utility in a non-Cold War world? Well, NATO's utility in a non-Cold War world was contributing to a new Cold War. So it's now doing the opposite of what it was intended to do. And we need to take a look at what does American security and prosperity look like now that we really have moved into a world that is not the same world that NATO was constructed in. So what is the interest of the United States? So the interest of the United States is peace and freedom for its people, security and prosperity for its people. Right now, I think you could make the argument that NATO is not contributing to those things.
Okay, yeah.
Instead of sending our troops over to protect the borders of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and so forth, or over there, we should be putting our troops in the border of our own country.
Yeah.
The U.S.-Mexico border. There's an invasion going on.
That
there,
irony hasn't been missed.
migration invasion happening there, and in fact, that's how. Mexico and Russia are vastly different, obviously, but Putin, for decades, if you listen to his speeches, he has talked about that part of Russia's foreign policy is the protection of Russian nationals abroad. That's the justification in part he used to go invade the country of Georgia. So Congress, what they should not do is pass any kind of resolution that it gives the president, the executive branch, broad powers to support Ukraine, because those broad powers could further escalate tension. So Congress should be very prudent as to what it does, and every member of Congress should be reading every jot and tittle, every letter of any kind of bills that are put in front of them with regards to potential action in Ukraine.
Well, gentlemen, thank you. Thank you for all that knowledge, and thank you for providing what we hope is a deeper look into this messy situation. There you have it, folks. Hopefully, we've helped provide a deeper understanding of this complicated, messy situation. Please share this video with others and urge your federal representatives to withdraw the U.S. from NATO. And like Christian said, look over carefully any bill that may be presented. And remember that whatever ails society, freedom is the cure.